Well, we might start. I'm just going to welcome everyone, and it's a good turnout, to our second of our forums about labour and ideas post-COVID. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land wherever we are, and in our case, in Moonee Ponds, it's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. The purpose of this session is to hear from Jim Chalmers and to discuss the future of our economy and what Labor's proposed so far. But before we get into listening to Jim, just a few housekeeping matters. We are recording this session. We're also showing it on Facebook and YouTube. For those of you who haven't been to one of these events, it's designed to be relaxed, respectful, and inclusive. So there's a few things which will give you the best experience. We encourage you to keep your video on. That's entirely up to you, but generally the experience is better as we talk with our video on. If you're on a computer or a laptop, you can set your screen to gallery view, and we can have a giant Brady Bunch image of the Labor Party and our fellow travellers. There is a chat function. Please use it to ask questions or make a comment. We welcome you to introduce yourself so that everyone knows who you are. If you're not able to use the chat function, there is a raise your hand function as well. Everyone is muted. I've got 3 of my staff here, and an administrator will unmute you if you're called upon during the question and answer session, but you will have to accept the unmuting before you can be heard. If you have any technical issues, please use the private message, our tech support person for the chat room. Now I'd like to hand over to talk about Jim, to hear from Jim. Jim is our Shadow Treasurer. He was an absolutely standout frontbencher whilst I was leader, and I think he really has been crystallising the economic attack for Anthony and for the whole Labor team. So we're very fortunate to have him tonight to talk to us, but also to listen to us. I should add, on a personal note, Jim's been most concerned about what's been happening in Melbourne, and he's been incredibly diligent, checking in, seeing what's going on, and he understands that he hasn't been in Melbourne during the lockdown, but he's taken a great interest in how Melburnians are going, how our businesses are going, how our families are going, and of course the difficulties and the challenges we've seen in aged care, just for example. But why don't I hand over to Jim now to talk, and then we'll have a great discussion for the next hour. Jim, over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Bill, and thanks to you and your team really for the opportunity to spend an evening with so many members and supporters and fellow travellers from Melbourne and from Victoria and perhaps further afield as well. I want to begin by acknowledging the Yugambeh and the Yagara people, who are the traditional owners of the lands on which I grew up and represent now here in Logan City, just to the south of Brisbane. I wanted to acknowledge Bill as well, not just for the invitation, the very kind invitation to be here with you all tonight, but also for his friendship over a period of time, and most of all for the opportunities that he has provided me personally over the time that he was leader. I wanted to acknowledge that amongst friends as well. And I also wanted to thank all of you for giving up a part of your evening to talk about really what's going on in the economy and what we think will happen in the economy and what we actually need to do about it into the future. And so I think the best way for us to come at this, it's a big topic, but I think the best way for us to come at this is to think, okay, when the virus is contained, when the COVID ward's empty, you know, what is the most important or a couple of the most important questions that we should be thinking about? And in my view, the most important thing is, can we make our economy and our society better, stronger, more inclusive, more sustainable after COVID-19 than it was before COVID-19? I think that's the key question. And if you accept that that's the key question, then obviously we need to work out how we go about that. You might hear my 1-year-old going crazy in the background. I'm sorry about that. Okay, so those are the most important questions. And so in order for us to come at those questions, we need to kind of understand what the economy looked like before COVID, what this recession has meant for us, and what we expect to happen as we start to slowly recover. And sorry, I should be back now. I'm not sure how much of that you lost. But I was saying that we need to think about, in order for us to work out how we can be better after COVID than we were before, we need to understand what things were like before COVID, what this recession has meant for us, and what things will look like afterwards. And I think in doing that, we need to recognise that things weren't real flash in the economy before COVID-19 arrived. And not just because of those horrific bushfires we had over Christmas, but really for some years, we've had an issue with insecure work and stagnant wages, and a whole range of issues around business investment and productivity and household debt and public debt. A lot of the things that we're thinking about now haven't just shown up because of COVID-19. They've been around for some time. They've been accelerated by this pandemic. Then we need to understand what this recession actually means for us, what it means for our economy and what it means for our communities. And then after that, we need to recognise that the recovery is going to be patchy. And what will look like a recovery on paper for a lot of people, or for the national political conversation, will actually feel for a lot of people like we're still in recession for some time. There'll be some communities, no doubt Victoria will have some issues with the patchiness of the recovery. Some of the communities around Australia, well, there'll be some concentrated unemployment and some concentrated disadvantage as well. And so if you think about that context, really the challenge for us in governments and oppositions is to work out, well, if we're going to have all of this debt, we're going to rack up all of this spending, how can we do that most effectively to deal with some of those issues that I've identified? And that's why we have been pretty critical of the government's budget, because it seems like a big missed opportunity. Having racked up $1 trillion in debt, $100 billion in new spending programs, it seems remarkable, really. It beggars belief, frankly, that you can spend that much money and still have unemployment expected to be too high for too long. You can still have many people left out, a lot of policy areas not touched on, which I'll come to in a minute. But I think most consequentially is, how can we have a situation where the government has spent this much money and still focused almost entirely on the next 12 or 18 months and not have much to say about what the future looks like, the future of the economy, the future of our societies, and what we need to be thinking about now if we want things to be better after than they were before. And that's why we put a lot of thought and a lot of effort into the budget reply that Anthony gave a couple of days after the budget, and that great speech that many of you tuned into and gave great feedback on. And what we tried to say there was, well, there's a lot of focus on the budget being in a really bad condition, and obviously it is. There's never been so much debt before in the Commonwealth budget. Our view is it's not just the level of that debt that matters, that does matter, but it's the quality of the spending that leads to that debt. And so our view is, if you're going to spend that much money, why don't we spend it more effectively, spend it more wisely? Some things the government did we support, but there seems to be a lot of missed opportunities at the core of the budget. And so that's why Anthony focused his budget reply on four main things. How do we get childcare right so that people can participate more fully in work, particularly Australian women? Secondly, how do we modernise the energy network so that we can get that cleaner and cheaper energy into the system and pass on the savings to families and businesses? Thirdly, what are we going to do about social housing so that we're making a big investment which creates a lot of jobs but also creates a lasting benefit for our most vulnerable people? And fourthly, how do we recognise that the government is spending hundreds of billions of dollars in the next little while on big projects, whether they be defence or rail or other infrastructure? How do we make sure we're getting more Australian jobs out of that spending, particularly Australian apprenticeships? And so those were the four areas that Anthony focused on, and they really are a bit of a down payment or a bit of a sense of the kinds of directions that we think governments need to take if we are to make the economy stronger after COVID than it was before. Clearly, there are other areas as well, and some areas of interest of mine, some of the work that we're doing with the Shadow Cabinet colleagues around, what else do we need to be doing to make sure that we are fully capturing the opportunities of the recovery when it comes. And for me, there are things that are really important. Cheaper and cleaner energy is an obvious one. How we train for technological change is a big one. How we get the co-investment right so that we're investing in things like advanced manufacturing and other important industries. How do we build an investment culture around that? How do we get the commercialisation system right so that we're turning our good ideas into good Australian jobs, which is something we haven't been that good at historically? And then lastly, how do we recognise, as I said before, that if the recovery is patchy and some communities need more help than others, what are we going to do in terms of specific jobs programs for specific communities? So we avoid that thing that keeps us awake at night, which is the sense that this spike in unemployment could become long-term unemployment, and that cascades and concentrates through the generations and causes all kinds of social dislocation. That's what's happened in recessions past, and we can't let it happen again. So that's some of our thinking, Bill, as you know, and hopefully it's an opportunity to get a good conversation started. I'm grateful for any contributions or perspectives or questions that friends might have on the call.
Hi. Okay. I just welcome people's contributions on what Jim has said. Jim has indicated that he's pretty keen to hear your point of view about what we should be talking about economically and what are some of the priorities. I should also say to you that we have nearly 300 people on Facebook watching this as well, so that's really good participation. I'm just going to go to the first of the thread of the chat room. But I will just say, Jim, before we get to that, and I just acknowledge Danny Pearson, the state member for Essendon's joined us. So he will have some perspectives, and indeed in his role, he'll probably have some ideas, Jim, for what we need to do to assist Victoria in particular.
Yep,
so Stephen Parnis, I've got Stephen, Jim, and is a trauma surgeon and been very involved with the AMA, and even though he's much younger looking than me, we went to school together too, but he's in the local Moonee Ponds area. So Stephen, over to you.
Good on you, Bill, and thanks, Jim. Bill's always been significantly older, I have to say. Jim, for the last 70 years, we've relied on population growth to really assist with our economic prosperity, and that tap's going to be turned off for an unspecified period of time, and that's going to have a real impact on a whole number of economic indicators. What are your thoughts about how we should anticipate and deal with that? Not just from a dollars perspective, but from the perspective of the social benefits that immigration have brought us for such a long time. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks very much, Stephen. Great question, I think, because any of you who read in The Age the good work of Shane Wright and others who write about these sorts of things, Shane's pointed out that what we expect to see in terms of the slowdown in population growth because of the closure of the international border will be the equivalent of taking Adelaide out of the national economy, which is a pretty mind-blowing kind of an event if you think about it. And it really teaches us and tells us or reminds us that we have been so reliant on population growth for economic growth for some time. In 2019, before COVID, in the absence of population growth, there would have been almost no economic growth whatsoever. So we are getting a bit of a sense of what we've lost by closing the international border for all the right reasons and all the rest of it. But it is a massive challenge, and it puts the onus on us, at least for the next year or two, to lean more heavily on those other sources of growth, getting participation in the economy right, getting productivity right, investment, spending power, all of these sorts of things are even more important. But I think what it also does, this kind of hitting the pause button on immigration for the time being, is it gives us an opportunity to rethink not just how much we value it, but what's the kind of best version of a population strategy. And Bill's and my colleagues have been putting some thought in this. Keneally, Giles and others have been putting some thought into it. But clearly, and I was talking to Libby Coker about this in Geelong this morning on Zoom, clearly we've got an opportunity to think about how our population is distributed. A lot of people have had the opportunity to work from places which aren't CBDs. And so for Geelong or Wollongong or Newcastle or whatever it might be, the Sunshine or Gold Coast in Queensland, people are thinking about the distribution of our population and what's the best kind of mix that we can have, so that when migration does kick in again and we get those strong flows again, which we want and we need, then how do we make sure that that's distributed effectively? Because we get an economic benefit from it, but as you rightly point out, Stephen, there's a massive social upside, and we shouldn't be dealing ourselves out of either of those things. But if we're to take maximum advantage of all of those opportunities, then we need to be smart about what it looks like when we turn the tap back on.
All right. And David Hutchinson is going to ask a question to camera. David, nice to see you.
Thanks, Bill. Hello, Jim. Look, I was just wondering what country or blend of countries should we look to for inspiration? Short question.
Yeah, I think I lost you for a bit. You said what countries to look to for inspiration. Well, I think on the health front, we've done in aggregate pretty well. And so I think a lot of countries would probably be looking to us in terms of some of that. In terms of the economy, I don't think anyone has fared perfectly. I think you rewind sort of 10 or 12 years ago, and there was a couple of standouts during the global financial crisis, and Australia was one of them. And clearly our economy is performing a bit better this time round than some of the other countries that we compare ourselves to, but we kind of should be, I think. We've got a lot of advantages here, and my fear is that we're not executing a lot of the good ideas like wage subsidies as well as we should. So I think the short answer to your question is I don't think anyone's really nailed it, the economic response. We certainly haven't here as a country. But we've made a lot of strides on the health front that we should be proud of. When you look at some of the other countries that have got second and third outbreaks, the UK, the US, much of Europe, then I think on the health front there's a lot we can be proud of.
It wasn't particularly thinking of the health front. I guess I was looking more at the economies of countries and their education system,
right?
Their business system, their research, and tying research to the economy.
Yeah.
Countries would we look forward, or could we look to for inspiration, or blend of countries?
Yeah. Thanks, David, and thanks for clearing that up. Well, I think it is a blend. I mean, in terms of commercialization and innovation and turning our ideas into jobs, the Americans are still the gold standard there. Clearly, in terms of lifelong learning, there's lots we can learn from Singapore. They do a lot of on the job training as people go, so that they're constantly updating their skills for technological change. Clearly, in terms of early education, there's some examples in Europe, and particularly Northern Europe, about how we do a great job supporting our early educators and get all the advantages from having our kids in some version of education as early as possible. So I think it is a blend of those kinds of countries. But if we make our priorities clear, some of those things I talked about, energy, training, commercialization, those sorts of things, then we can pick from a menu of ideas overseas, but there's no reason why we can't be kind of market leaders in some of these sorts of things. We've got a good history here of being policy innovators, whether it's Medicare, superannuation, and other things. So there's no reason why we have to kind of necessarily photocopy the policies of another country. We've got a lot of advantages, and we should take maximum advantage of those.
All right. Thanks, David. Now, I've got another couple of questions, one on Facebook and one from Brindley Pereira. Brindley's a small businessman in Essendon. Do you want to ask your question to camera, Brindley? I'll just unmute you.
Yep, I've just unmuted myself. Thanks, Bill. Good to see you. Jim, thanks for your time. Is there any forecast or modelling around the real unemployment that will hit come March, April, May? Because that's when the real fun will start. Whilst I own a renewable business in Essendon, I've got an insolvency background as an accountant. And, speaking to some liquidators and friends of mine in the past, they've got companies and businesses just waiting to liquidate and just artificially holding on. And how will that, impact, small businesses going forward, which is, a lifeline to a lot of the local community, because if the unemployment hits, there'll be very little spending, so your disposable income goes, You know, and it has an ongoing severe impact. And how can we recover? I mean, it's, as you said, $1 trillion. That's a lot of money handed out. And I hear today, which is great news, about the plant in Geelong, but there's an $84 million hit back to the taxpayer. You know, so some significant points there.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm just hoping that we'll come through this.
Yeah, thanks, Brinley. I think there are a handful of really important issues in your question. First of all, yes, there are a lot of businesses which will fall over, unfortunately, and the government is taking some steps to change the insolvency arrangements, which you are probably familiar with your background, and that's sort of one aspect of it. But our way of thinking is, if you're a good business before COVID, then there's a responsibility on all of us to try and ensure that businesses can hang on if we expect them to be good businesses after COVID. And unfortunately, we're going to lose a lot of good businesses because of the way that some of this support in the economy is being withdrawn prematurely, in my view. That's an opinion. Whether it's JobKeeper, also JobSeeker in terms of the amount of money flowing in the economy, some of the other ways that we're supporting people and workers and businesses and communities. In my view, the government's in too big a rush to pull that out, and they're doing that for financial reasons. But my fear is that the worse they mishandle that, the more costly it will be for the budget for longer, because you'll have people unemployed needlessly. You'll have people joining those unemployment queues. So it might end up being counterproductive. So the most important thing we can do in this space is to make sure that government isn't in a rush. They don't just snap this support back out of the economy too early, because that will cruel the recovery for businesses and workers and the country before it even properly gathers pace. And the more people that we let lose their connection to their job or lose their small business, the longer and harder it will be to recreate all of that. And when you look at the history of recessions around the world, one of the big things we're worried about is that long-term unemployment I mentioned before, but also the kind of destruction of capital and skills and all those sorts of things. The messier it gets now, the longer it'll take to come good again. And so that's why I think the government should step in, but also not pull out their support too early.
Thanks,
Jim. Jim's making a very important point that federal Labor's been saying, that you can't just simply wind back JobKeeper and pretend everything's fine, whilst other parts of Australia may be moving on. In Melbourne and in Victoria, you know, we're just where other places were 3-6 months ago. So this is something which the Victorian federal Labor MPs are making very clear, that Melbourne has been in a very difficult position for a lot longer than the rest of Australia. And just Morrison just simply saying you can click your fingers and pretend you're back in Kansas is just illogical. I've got a question from from Facebook. Mr. Len Feeder. I'm just going to read it out to you, Jim. And it goes, how are we going to help the over 50s and the 60s who lose their jobs during this pandemic? As history tells you, these people will probably never get a meaningful job in again. What can we do to help people in their 50s and 60s who have suffered job loss?
Yeah, thanks, Len, for the question. I should acknowledge that this that kind of cohort of workers has been one of Bill's real focuses. As I recall it, one of the first kind of policy conversations I ever had with Bill when I was his parliamentary secretary was around, you know, what are we going to do about older workers who lose their job or are at risk of losing their job, and confront being out of the workforce really for the whole time up until they qualify for the age pension. And what recessions do is historically is attack that cohort of workers the hardest. But what this one's doing is it's getting the bookends of the labour market. So very young workers and over 50 workers, they're the ones that we kind of fear most losing their attachment to the labour market and all of the consequences that brings for their own families, but also for the economy and society more broadly. And so when we put this to the government, they announced that they had a hiring credit scheme for workers under 35 years old. Obviously, we're not against helping younger workers who are at risk from this recession, but it seems quite bizarre to exclude 928,000 people on unemployment benefits who won't qualify. for that hiring credit scheme. And it will be particularly tough on older workers over 50, over 55. So when we put that to the government, they say, oh, we've already got a hiring credit scheme for those workers. It's called Restart. And so we have a look at Restart and we go through the books and we ask a few questions of the Senate committee process. And it turns out that Restart is one of the least successful programs in a competitive field that the government's had the last 7 years. Woefully undersubscribed, helping almost nobody. Most people who get a job via the hiring credit are out of work again within 3 months. A lot of churn and all of those sorts of issues. And so it's a bit of a dog's breakfast at the moment. So what we'll be saying to the government as they look to put their hiring credit for younger workers through the parliament is it's all well and good to do something for younger workers. It would have been good if you cared about younger workers when you were ripping away their penalty rates and attacking their TAFEs and universities and all the rest of it. But if you want to do something for younger workers, what are you going to do for older workers? Because we are equally concerned about workers who might be 55 or 60 years old and not ready to go or not eligible to go on a pension yet, who want to do more work. And that might require some smart thinking from the government because the labour market is going to be pretty tricky for them for a long time.
Thanks for that. We're getting questions fast and furious, both in the chat room and on Facebook. John and Suzanne, why don't you ask your question? And it's about the debit card, cashless debit cards, about the rate of New Start and your thoughts on it. John and Suzanne.
So,
You're on.
Unmute me. Am I on? Yes, I am. Good. Excellent. Sorry, the question is New Start. New Start as it was clearly unlivable. Nobody can live on $40 a day. We have a son who's been living on that for some time, and it's extraordinarily difficult for him. We want your thoughts on on New Start staying at the level that perhaps it is now, and also your thoughts on the thought of the cashless debit card. There are some private enterprise people who stand to make a great deal of money out of sponsoring this card. And I just want your thoughts on that, please.
Yeah, thanks very much, John, for being on the call, and Suzanne, and for those questions. I'll take them in the order that you asked them. I think first of all on job seeker, I think the argument has more or less been run and won now that $40 a day is not good for the individual person looking for a job, too hard to support themselves, as you said, with your boy. But also it's not good for the economy, which has lacked spending power for really some years now. There's not enough disposable income in the economy. So this is one of those policies where we can actually tick a few boxes at once. We can do something right and just from a social justice point of view. We can do something that helps people better support themselves while they look for work, which is what we're asking of them. And we can also do something which is good for the economy. And there's a remarkable consensus now about that didn't exist, even 2, 3, 4 years ago. The business community, the union movement, obviously Labor's been leading the charge, ACOS and others all agree, even John Howard agrees. And so it seems a bit strange that the current government has left people hanging. They've had a temporary increase and they've said, we're going to end that temporary increase at Christmas, and we'll tell you if the rate's going to be any different, a week or two before Christmas. And I can only imagine the kind of uncertainty and the anxiety that creates in the community. And we're not talking about a handful of people here. Unfortunately, your son's not alone in having this challenge. There's 1.5 million people on unemployment benefits. And so we've been campaigning pretty strongly to say, let's do something more decent than $40 a day. We'll find out in the next 5 or 6 weeks what the rate is and how much that costs and all the rest of it. We'll engage with that then. The cashless debit card is something that has a relatively long history, as you probably know. You sound like you've followed this. And in some of our remote Indigenous communities, there was a request that they have it. And so there was trial sites and there's been some tests about that. It hasn't been as effective as what a lot of proponents of it would like. But what the government's tried to do, I think, largely for ideological reasons, they like to get the front page of the newspaper by saying they're going to pick on the most vulnerable people. And so they've tried to expand it, including to communities like Bundaberg, 3 or 4 hours up the road from me in Queensland, and the community doesn't want it. And what Linda Burney's done a good job of saying, and Bill and others, Albo and the whole team, is if a community genuinely wants this, then let's have a look at it. But if the community obviously doesn't want it, if there's not community support for it, then it's probably counterproductive. It also means that if you're on a payment, then, and there's only a limited amount of outlets that you can use your card at, it means you can't shop around, you can't get good deals and all that sort of thing. So there's a lot of hairs on it. Long way of saying a lot of hairs on it.
Yeah,
and that's why we don't support the rollout in these other communities.
Okay,
good on you. Thank you so much.
thank you.
Thanks. You're right. The cashless debit card, I think, has not proven to be the magic bullet compared to proper jobs and housing and healthcare that the proponents say it is. Listen, we've got another question from Scott. He's asked me to read it out because he doesn't have a microphone on his computer. Then we'll go to Facebook. This one's about international trade, Jim, and of course the looming problems with China. Scott has said, from a global perspective, with China's continuing wolf warrior, in inverted commas, that's their policy, their stance, their wolf warrior stance, what alternative markets are being investigated for our exports, in addition to trying to remedy relations with China? That's from Scott.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Nice, easy one. Nice, easy one there. Look, I don't think anybody pretends that the management of the relationship with China isn't getting more difficult, more complex, more consequential. And I think equally, there's nobody on any side of politics or around the world who doesn't think that China has been more assertive in recent times in the way that they have, staked their claims in the world. And that does invite those two questions that you raised. What are our businesses going to do about markets? And I think, I spend a lot of time in the business community, a lot of Zoom rooms and boardrooms, and the way it gets put to me is, obviously we would all like diverse markets, but China is a massive, massive opportunity, and it'd be mad to turn our back on it, even with these sorts of difficulties. So I think, companies are looking at India and Indonesia and elsewhere, Vietnam, in our region in particular, but I think we still have a big future and lots of lots of prosperity to be won and gained from a better relationship with China, which gets you to the second part of your question. Foreign policy and trade policy is never as black and white as people would like it to be. It's always dealing in shades of grey. You never get everything you want. You rarely get nothing that you want. And so trade is a bit like that, where we've got no choice but to pursue via the usual diplomatic channels to try and resolve some of these issues, which have meant that some of our products have been left on docks or in airports. And we owe that to our exporters and to all the people they employ to do that the best we can. That's why we try and support the government where they are genuinely making that effort, but also pointing out where we think that some of the commentary that comes from the Liberal backbench might not be helpful. And that's not a kind of a flick a switch to solve the problem. I don't think there is a switch to be flicked in this regard. It's just the long, hard work of diplomatic negotiation and careful management of our relationships.
Thanks, and Jim's right. It's not straightforward. Diversifying and improving our relations with China are twin strategies we have to try and pursue. Tracy Edhouse from Facebook has a question, and I'll just read it out to you, Jim. Why aren't tradies funded and trained to build public housing in all states of Australia in order to make the waiting lists go down to zero? It'd be jobs for tradies and public housing needs. So, I think we've got plenty to say on that, Jim.
Yeah, well, I agree with you 100%, Tracy. I mean, if you sat down with 100 economists and asked them to nominate two things which would be the best thing you could do for the economy, almost all of them would have in their top two priorities doing something about social housing, because it ticks all those boxes that you just mentioned, Tracy. It's locally focused. You can't just create it all in a factory in one place and disperse it around the country. It's got to be done locally. So it engages a lot of local tradespeople, which is important when you consider the kind of construction cliff that we are confronting in this recession. But also it builds something which is of lasting benefit, particularly to our most vulnerable people. It's an extraordinary opportunity. if you recognise we're going to be spending money and every dollar of that money that we spend is borrowed, then why not try and tick all of those boxes that we just ran through and build something that lasts? We actually think the best beginning for that, and pay tribute here to Anthony and to Jason Clare and other colleagues, it's actually possible to get some of that stimulus happening literally within a couple of weeks if we focus first on repairing some of the social housing, some of the homes that have fallen into disrepair in this country. You can get that happening more or less immediately. And then you can start contemplating building some more homes because there is still obviously a shortage. So I think social housing should be a massive priority. I genuinely can't understand how the government could borrow $1 trillion and not throw even a cent in the direction of building or maintaining social housing. And I think we'd do things a lot differently if we were given the chance.
Let's be very clear, Labor's articulated we invest in the maintenance of public housing. I know Danny Pearson's done a lot of work in public housing and social housing and the southern end of the Maribyrnong electorate, and we just think this is a superb priority, and it's got great equity outcomes as well as job outcomes. I've got a few more questions. We don't know the questioner's name from the chat, but it is as follows, Jim. Have we got the balance right between the emphasis on supporting tourism, which this questioner says is semi-skilled and casualised, not building productive capacity, as opposed to high-tech innovation, knowledge-intensive building productive capacity?
Yeah, well, I think the good news is, or the kind of glass half full way to look at this is, a country of our sophistication with the quality of our workforce and some of our other benefits means that we don't really have to choose in absolute terms between those two things. And what we would like to see coming out of this recession is a more diverse, more kind of complex, broader economy, so that we're not as reliant, just on one or two major industries. And so I think it's possible to recognise the challenges in tourism. Tourism will always be a massive earner for this country and a massive employer. But there's nothing that says we can't chase that market without getting better at the kind of high value added, advanced manufacturing, highly innovative businesses, which will come if we get the commercialisation piece right. So I think all of that's possible. If you think about what's happened to those two parts of the economy, tourism is a real multi-speed thing at the moment. If you're within driving distance of Sydney or Brisbane, you're going okay. If you're relying on the international borders like Cairns in far north Queensland, then you're in real strife. So tourism will come back at a different pace depending on what part of the market that you're in. The other part, I think, is going to require some really smart government, not just the research and development tax incentive, as important as that is, but getting the university thing right, hooking up universities and the CSIRO and the investment community so that we can see more of our ideas turn into jobs here on shore rather than disappear overseas and to become big employers and big earners for other countries. I think there's a real role there for government, certainly something that I and Brendan O'Connor and other colleagues in Bill's and our team, we put a lot of thought into. I think it's going to be a big part of the story about the future economy.
Thank you, Jim. Two related questions. One from Kim Nicholson. Would Labor consider putting more arrangements in place to reignite Australian manufacturing? And there's a second question, which is like a related issue from Ashley Pollock. And it says, what's the current situation with Western Australia's Kwinana refinery closing down shortly, and our even more reliance on other countries' fuel and our lack of Australian flagged and crewed coastal tankers and vessels? So what are we going to do for Australian fuel security and seafarers? And what are we going to do to reignite Australian manufacturing?
Yeah, well, I might do manufacturing, Bill, and then you might want to do fuel security, given your long interest in that. Clearly, I mean, my view about Kwinana is it's a disaster, and at a time when we've got more concerns about fuel security rather than less, we can't afford to lose a refinery. And clearly, there are challenges in other refineries around the place too. There's one not far from you. There's one not far from me. But I'll leave that. Bill has got a real passion for fuel security, so I might do manufacturing. I think the best way to understand manufacturing is that this crisis has made us recognise that this kind of decimation of our manufacturing base has been bad for all the reasons that we were aware of, big employers going overseas and the like, but also it's cost us the ability to react and adapt quickly to different circumstances. Some of our industry was able to kind of quickly change to produce things that we desperately needed, masks and sanitizer and the like, but a lot of big parts of our manufacturing base in particular probably discovered that they weren't capable of that. I think the best way to think about how we get manufacturing going again is to recognise that it's not just the decision that we make. We're going to have a big services economy into the future, but how do we make manufacturing a stronger part of the broader economy? We don't just sit down and decide one day we want more manufacturing. We won't get it, frankly, unless we get energy costs down, a real passion of mine, unless we get the training piece right so that we're competing on quality rather than on wages. And unless we get some of those other innovation, commercialisation, turning our ideas into jobs issues right that we've discussed a bit already. I think if we did those things, we do give ourselves a chance to have more of the cochlears and more of the other kind of high value added manufacturing that a lot of people, almost everyone in this country wants to see. But I'll leave fuel to Bill because I know that he'll want to have a gallop on fuel.
Listen, it's just, we're an island nation that we don't have adequate fuel stores in this country is just a risk. And I know that the government says just leave it to the market, but if there's ever tensions and we all of a sudden foreign oil tankers couldn't come to Australia, our economy would grind to a halt very quickly. So I don't like to see the refineries close, and we should be storing more fuel here for some supplies, and that was our policy at the last election. The current government laughed at it at the last election, but they've now said they're going to do what we said we'd do. But the second part of Ashley's question is equally important. We're an island nation, yet we have very few Australian merchant vessels. You know, first world countries all around the world have merchant fleets. The Americans, for all their many challenges, have a large merchant marine. The English, the Germans, plenty of countries do, the Koreans. And what happens by not having our own Australian flagged merchant vessels is that we pay extra tariffs to the rest of the world to carry our exports and to carry our imports. And of course, in times of strategic difficulty, we don't have our own ships. So we should have a merchant marine reserve. We should have Australian ships and do what we need to do. As we know, we give tax support in other areas of the Australian economy to other sectors of business. I think it's very sensible to have our own ships and our own fuel reserves. And the government has copied our policy from the last election on this, not on the ships, but on the fuel reserve, and they should copy our ideas on the shipping too. But listen, the next question I've got, and we've got quite a few, and I'll try and I know Jim's working very hard in this hour, but Alison Wright has said, what ideas do we have to eliminate insecure work? So that's, you know, casualisation, and Jim and I can both give a view on that, but over to you, Jim.
Yeah, thanks, Alison. I think that the defining feature of the economy has basically been insecure work for some time now. That's why we've had a lot of underemployment. We've had a lot of casualisation, and that has led to stagnant wages. It's led to things like people not having sick leave when they need it most. And so if we care about that, and we care deeply about that, trying to fix that in the post-COVID economy, then you need to take a range of approaches. Obviously, the industrial relations system is part of it. Obviously, people need to have the capacity to turn their long-term casual jobs into permanent jobs. Clearly, we've put on the table things like pandemic leave, so that people who are working casual aren't forced to make a horrible decision between doing the right thing by their family and doing the right thing by their co-workers. We need to think about what are we going to do in the gig economy to make sure that there are some basic standards so that people aren't just kind of cannibalising each other in a part of the economy that hasn't been very well regulated because it sprung up so quickly. Training's part of it, of course, as well. Keeping some of the big employers afloat is part of it. But it's not one of those things where there's just kind of one solution to it. It's evolved over a long time. It'll take a long time to turn around. But if we let things kind of settle back where they were with underemployment, casualisation and insecure work, then we're just going to go back to all the same problems we had before about wages, lack of spending power. And that's really cyclical in the economy. It just creates this kind of cycle of economic weakness. And so we can't cop that, and so we need to do something about it.
Great, Jim. Ronnie, on the casuals, Labor has taken policies to its elections and no doubt will at the next one. Whilst there's always going to be casual employment in our economy, the longer a person's in a particular job, the more agency they should have in their job, and we shouldn't be relying on technicalities in the law to deny people basic rights at work. And of course, once you've got a permanent job, then you've got a stake in the economy. You can start having dreams of your holidays and your family and a house. So permanent work is absolutely part of, I think, maintaining a strong middle class and a ladder into the middle class, which is part of the Australian story. Ronnie Ann has a question, Jim, on in time of financial hardship, what are your thoughts about the proposed changes to the responsible lending laws?
Yeah, we're pretty concerned about them, Ronnie. We're working our way through them. I had a good conversation today, they won't mind me saying, with the Finance Sector Union about them. And we've been speaking to the banks, we've been speaking to the consumer groups, Consumer Action Law Centre and others, trying to get a handle on what's being proposed here. And we're really concerned, partly because we are typically suspicious of a government that wants to unwind consumer protections during a recession. That obviously gets a lot of orange and, if not red, lights flashing in our mind. We're particularly worried that it looks like they're trying to unwind one of the key initial recommendations of the Royal Commission that we fought so hard for into the banking system. So we're going to have discussions about that over the next week or two in our team when we're in Canberra. We've got a lot of consultation to do with affected stakeholders, but I think in principle, we're going to find it difficult to support something which unwinds consumer protections at a time when people are really vulnerable. If there's a genuine issue in the economy about the flow of finance, then let's sit down and try and work out a way that we can fix that in a way that doesn't make potentially vulnerable people in the economy even more vulnerable.
Thanks, Jim. And I hope that gives you an answer, Ron Ann. And the feedback, Jim, on the answers has been very positive on Facebook, so that's good to know. Listen, I've got 3 more questions. We're 10 minutes to the hour, so I'll just try and give you a couple of them in one go, Jim. Annie Nash has said that she's a Rusted-on Labor voter, so that's lovely, and just thank you, Annie. What are we going to do for new jobs for women, she asks.
Yeah, thanks very much, Annie, and thanks for your support for the party. Look, I think one of the most important things we've learned from this crisis is that if we want the situation for women's participation in work to change, then we need to change the policy settings, and that's why childcare is part of that. But in terms of new jobs for women, or new jobs in industries which have been traditionally dominated by women, really the hope of the side is across the care economy. And Bill's obviously one of the 3 key shadow ministers here. When you think about aged care, Julie Collins, disability care, Bill, and childcare, Amanda Rishworth, there's an extraordinary amount of jobs in those industries, really quite mind-blowing when you think about the growth in those sectors. And even much of the jobs growth that was happening 2019 before that, occasionally you'd hear the government jump up and talk about tens of thousands of jobs. A huge chunk of that was actually in the NDIS, which Bill is responsible for from our team. And so there's a role for the care economy. There's a role for getting more women involved in some of the industries traditionally dominated by men. But there's also a role for ensuring that women can actually actively participate in the workforce, even if they've got little kids.
Well, following up on that, we've got 2 more. Deborah Kavanagh's got a question where she says, what are we going to do for the pensioners? And specifically, she talked about an increase to pensioners. And there's another question from Ian Kershaw that insulin used to be made in Australia by CSL. Now we import synthetic insulin from overseas, and why don't we make synthetic insulin here in Australia? It's a vital product. So there's Deborah with the aged care, and Ian with the health manufacturing of vital goods.
Yeah. I'll start with Ian because I don't know the answer to that question, Ian. I'm not going to pretend that I do. Ideally, it would be good to have some self-sufficiency in some of these really crucial areas of need. I'm not quite sure why that's happened, but obviously that sounds suboptimal. Deborah's question about the age pension. You probably know, Deborah, that for the first time in I think 30 years or something, the pension was frozen in September when it ordinarily goes up by that tiny amount that the government crows about each year, twice a year. It was frozen. And that's because the government says, well, inflation didn't move and in aggregate inflation didn't move, but that doesn't take into account the fact that for a lot of pensioners, the things that pensioners rely on are getting more and more expensive. And so we thought that the government should have intervened properly to ensure that the pension wasn't frozen in the last month or two. Instead, they came with a couple of small payments either side of Christmas, better than nothing, but not really a solution to some of the really big cost of living pressures that pensioners confront.
All righty, thanks for that. Listen, I had one offbeat question, which was to me, was this zip-up cardigan my version of the North Face top? No, it's not. It's just, I wore an Adidas top last time and people thought I was running for Prime Minister of some Balkan country, so I thought the jumper might be a break from the Adidas top. Okay, more explanation. I'm using valuable time. Steve Parnis had a question, which I just read out. The National Cabinet was going to start so well, it became every state for itself. What would we do differently in our cooperative federalism, do you think?
Yeah, well, I think your diagnosis is right. It showed a lot of promise for a couple of months when things were at their most dire, but it relatively quickly degenerated. It won't surprise you to learn that I think that Scott Morrison was the first to flick the switch from we're all in this together to you're all on your own, and I don't need to tell Victorians about that. I mean, I think some of the ways that Morrison and his little mate Josh were taking pot shots at you when you were going through the most difficult part of this crisis, I thought it was disgraceful. I thought it was absolutely disgraceful. And that's part of the deterioration of the National Cabinet. Some of us have been believers in whatever you call it, COAG, National Cabinet. Some of us have been believers in better state-federal cooperation for a long time, and not just because of this situation that we're in now. And whether they meet by video or on the blower or in person or whatever you call it, I think the real challenge is to make sure that that National Cabinet process is as effective in more normal times, dealing with some of those other issues that we haven't been able to crack the last 5 or 7 or 10 years or whatever it is, as it was at the very start of the crisis. And I think if it goes back and degenerates into the same kind of back and forth that characterised COAG in 2019 and 18 and 17, then I think the risk is that we haven't learned anything about the capacity for Commonwealth-state relations to be a bit better and more productive.
All right, Jim, thanks for that answer. Listen, there's one last question. I'm conscious that to get people back next week to listen to Andrew Lee, we'll finish on time. We've still got a few minutes. Joanne Blanchard sent in and she says she highly regards both of our work, Jim, so I needed to read that out. She says, any updates on disability and aged care? Both really overlooked and highlighted. I don't know if you want to talk a bit about aged care and I'll briefly finish on the disability side of it.
Yeah, that sounds good, Bill. So aged care is obviously, for the first time really in my, 23 years in the Labor Party, aged care is a top of the pops issue. And that's because, well, for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because there are a lot of problems in the sector, but also because so many people have some kind of interaction with the system. And as you all probably know, aged care is 100% a federal responsibility. Morrison and Frydenberg don't want you to know that because things have been horribly mismanaged when it comes to COVID-19 and what's happened in in a lot of our aged care homes. And so we've got a Royal Commission which has come up with some interim recommendations and asked for the government to come back to them by the end of this month. That's really important to deal with some of the near-term issues around staffing, PPE equipment, transparency, so we know where all these billions of dollars is actually going if people are still malnourished in our aged care homes. That's important. And then there's a longer term piece too, which will come in February when the Aged Care Royal Commission reports in full. And that's where we'll deal with some of the bigger issues, still around workforce and transparency and all the rest of it, but also the best mix between public and private, the role of profit and all these sorts of things, because we can't go on any longer really with a system that has been letting our older people down for so long. Something needs to give. I suspect the government will do something about it in the May budget, but if they're true to form, it'll be a whole series of big announcemements and probably not a lot of follow through.
All right, thanks, Jim. And just briefly, Joanne, on disability, the problems in disability and aged care are very similar. All COVID has done is show the problems which previously existed and brought them to light. But we have a casualised workforce who's underpaid. We have a mix of private and public, and the private profit motive has been exposed. And whilst there's some good private operators, let me be very clear, the reality is, how do you serve two masters? Quality of care and making a profit. Now, some have managed to answer that question, but I think in others, it's a matter of do the people come last? The other thing we have to say, other than the workforce being properly remunerated and looked after, is our safeguards commissions don't do enough. The problems which existed during COVID, many of them were there beforehand. So I think that we need to have better watchdogs on the beat, and this all costs money, and it's a matter of priorities. But we'll see what the government does, and Labor will certainly look at how we can improve the level of care, be it an NDIS or an aged care. Jim, did you want to say a couple of final words very briefly, and then I'll wrap it up?
I did, Bill, and thanks again for the opportunity, and thanks everyone for making time. I really wanted to just leave you with a proper sense of the rest of the country's gratitude for and recognition of what you've all been through the last few months. I think in lots of ways, when you think about the sacrifices that you made the last little while, you've really taken one for the team in lots of ways, and you've helped ensure that the virus didn't spread even further throughout Australia. And so I'm not sure what it's like to have been locked down like you were for all the right reasons, because it was necessary to limit the spread of the virus. But I do know how much the rest of the country really appreciates it, acknowledges that. And I think that we should, find all kinds of ways for thanking you for that. You've had a remarkable run the last week or two, which has really warmed the heart the last little while. So well done on that. Thank you for all the sacrifices you've made. And our responsibility in Albo's opposition is to make sure that all of those sacrifices you've made the last little while are worth it. And we've actually got something to show for it as a country as we emerge.
Thanks, Jim. And Jim's right. Melburnians and Victorians can hold their head high. And I think we should also acknowledge Dan Andrews here. He's it's been very difficult, and but he's come through. He's helped us come through. There's still a lot of pain, and no one says it's not hard for the small businesses, and there is a lot of pain. And all we need to do is display the same resolve we have in dealing with the economic problems as we have with the health problems. And I'm sure that Melbourne can help lead the way nationally, economically too. We're hearing what you're saying. Jim's outlined a vision of Australian more economic independence, moving up the value chain, manufacturing, diversifying our economy, being bold overseas, building our relations, but also investing in our own people. And I think the final interesting lesson out of COVID from tonight's discussion is a strong safety net, aged care, disability, the job seeker, a strong minimum wage, proper employment conditions. When the people who are less well off in society have got money in the pocket to spend, that's a rising tide that lifts all boats. When we look after the people less well off, that's an economic plan for the whole country. So thanks very much, Jim. You're doing a tip-top job. You've got a lot of admirers here, and we look forward to more questions and more debate going forward. And November the 11th, we've got Andrew Lee, who's a very imaginative and innovative Member of Parliament. And then we've got Claire O'Neill in December for our Ideas Forums. Thank you, everybody. Sorry if you didn't get questions in. We'll follow up the rest of them, and we'll write to you and talk to you. Let's keep making ideas the #1 petrol currency of politics. Good night.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks, Jim. Tip top.